They said she was just the girl who scrubbed mud off army trucks, a background fixture in fatigues with soap-stained gloves. Nothing more than a mechanic's shadow in a world of uniforms that measured worth in combat scars and loud reputations. But they didn't know that a single phrase, 6 words whispered through static, would turn every sneer into silence and every doubt into fear, because the day the captain's voice cut across the radio with Valkyrie Cipher on me was the day the truth finally bled out of shadows, the day the base realized that the soldier they had overlooked was the one holding their survival in her hands. If you agree that quiet strength often hides the deadliest courage, make sure to like and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you is a story of misjudgment, revelation, and the weight of secrets no soldier ever brags about. She was 28 then, still young enough to be underestimated. Still in that fragile age where veterans twice her years thought her service was just beginning, even though her record stretched longer than most of theirs. A child of persistence more than privilege, she had earned her stripes not in the glamour of firefights or the roar of armored convoys, but in the tireless grind of logistics, hauling supplies, maintaining vehicles, keeping lifelines moving when others were too tired or too proud to dirty their hands. The mud on her boots was her ribbon, the grease under her nails her uniform, yet somehow those tokens of labor only made her invisible. She remembered the smirks when she bent to scrape clay from Will Wells, the muttered jokes about truck girl and detailing specialist. As though the soldiers laughing had never been saved by the very convoys she kept alive. But she didn't complain, not out loud, because to her silence was its own armor, and there was something she carried that none of them could imagine. A clearance level buried beneath classification stamps. A skill set tucked into training files marked for eyes far higher than the rank and file who dismissed her. That morning, the sky had been low and heavy, swollen with storm clouds that smelled of iron and rain, the kind of weather that plastered uniforms to backs and made every task twice as miserable. She worked the brush hard against the caked mud of a battered deuce and a half, the bristles squealing against metal panels, water running black at her feet. Her shoulders ached, her hands numb, but she moved with practiced rhythm, the kind of endurance born from years of knowing her place was not to shine, but to endure. The laughter carried over from a group of infantry nearby, leaning against a Humvee with cigarettes dangling, watching her work as if she were entertainment, one of them calling out, "Hey Valkyrie, missed a spot," not knowing the irony that would come to choke his voice later. She gave no reaction, eyes focused, the brush steady, her discipline honed on something far sharper than their taunts. And then it came, a break in the monotony, the radio at her hips sputtering with static, voices tight and clipped, convoy command reporting garbled chatter, signals intercepted, nothing clear but urgent enough to knot every stomach within earshot. She froze for a moment, listening, the brush slipping from her fingers as the static built into a burst of words that cut through like a blade. The captain's voice, low, sharp, commanding, "Valkyrie Cipher on me." The phrase hit her like a trigger pulled, a buried code unearthed. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her other name, the one stamped in red ink on documents she wasn't supposed to mention, the identity she had locked beneath layers of routine. Around her, the mocking soldiers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, suddenly realizing that the call wasn't a mistake, that it was for her. She straightened, water dripping from her sleeves, her heartbeat thunder against the drum of rain, and without a word she unbuckled the radio, clipped it back to her belt, and walked, calm and steady, toward the command tent. Every step felt like the line between two worlds, the one where she was invisible, and the one where she was everything. And in that moment she knew the day she had scrubbed mud until her fingers bled, the day she had laughed quietly at the ignorance of others, the day she had swallowed pride to keep peace. It was all leading here. The storm rolled overhead, wind tearing at canvas, soldiers scrambling as alerts spread, and still her mind was a calm, focused river. She remembered her advanced training in a windowless bunker, the notebooks filled with cipher patterns, the drills that left her trembling, but sharper than steel. She remembered the face of the officer who had handed her the call sign, Valkyrie Cipher, telling her it was a role few could hold, fewer could endure, and that one day the weight of entire units might rest on the speed of her mind. And now that day had come, disguised as an ordinary afternoon of scrubbing trucks. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just kept walking as the captain's tent loomed ahead, soldiers parting in silence, their eyes burning with the uncomfortable sting of realization. The girl they thought was nothing more than a pair of hands with a brush was now walking into the heart of command, carrying secrets she had guarded in silence for years. And though they didn't know it yet, though they would whisper about it long into the night, this was the moment their base was saved not by firepower, not by muscle, but by a cipher and a soldier who had always been more than the mud on her boots. The captain didn't look up when she entered the command tent, but his voice, tight as a wire and heavy with urgency, cut through the storm-lashed air. "You heard the call, Valkyrie. We don't have time." Maps lay scattered across the table, radio screened with overlapping voices, and somewhere outside, the klaxon wailed as the base moved from idle routine to full-scale alert, soldiers scrambling, boots pounding in the mud. She stepped closer, water dripping from her sleeves, her gloves leaving smears across the oilskin map as she steadied herself, her eyes sweeping the chaos with the calm detachment of someone who had been trained for this very fracture in reality. The captain slid a slip of paper toward her, its edges still warm from the radio printer, words and numbers scrawled across it in jagged lines, coded so tightly that to most eyes it would look like nonsense. But to her it was a language buried deep in her bones, one she had spent years deciphering in windowless rooms while the rest of the world thought she was just another pair of hands on base. She pulled the battered notebook from her pocket, the one she'd carried since her training days, pages dog-eared and weathered, margins filled with notes that weren't supposed to exist outside government vaults. Her pencil scratched fast, symbols turning to fragments, fragments linking into phrases, her lips moving soundlessly as her mind raced through permutations. Outside, thunder cracked so loud it rattled the tent poles, and every soldier nearby leaned closer, as if her silence might birth the words that determined whether they lived or died. She remembered the officer who had told her back then, "Cipher work isn't glamorous. You'll never fire the shot, never be in the footage they play back home. But you'll carry the burden of time, the seconds that decide battles before anyone knows there's a fight." And now, here she was, carrying that burden alone as the clock ticked down. At first the message resisted, scrambled like a knot of snakes, but then a pattern surfaced, one she recognized from long nights of drills, an old code, Soviet in origin but twisted, repurposed by insurgent groups who had picked it up like scavenged weapons. Her chest tightened. The words she pulled free from the static weren't about the convoy at all. They weren't setting an ambush down the road. They were circling the base itself, planning to strike while the storm masked their approach, a coordinated assault that would gut them before they even realized what hit them. She looked up sharply, her pencil pausing mid-word. "They're not after the convoy," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like glass. The captain froze, his eyes narrowing. "Say that again." She shoved the notebook forward, her handwriting jagged but clear. "Base strike. Coordinated. Tonight." Around them, the chatter died as soldiers leaned in, disbelief etched into their faces. The captain swore under his breath, the weight of it sinking fast. He snatched the decoded sheet, eyes flicking to the clock on the wall, then barked orders into the comms with a sharpness that cracked like a whip. Within seconds, the tent became a hive, orders flying, defenses mobilizing, artillery repositioning, scouts dispatched into the storm. And in the middle of it all she sat, pencil still in hand, her chest pounding with adrenaline, but her face composed, because this was the role nobody ever saw. The silent war, the one fought not with rifles, but with symbols on a page. She didn't need recognition. She needed accuracy, and she dove back into the message, pulling out more fragments, timestamps, troop numbers, coordinates, each one another piece of the storm pressing down on them. She knew the soldiers outside, the same ones who had mocked her that morning, were now running to position because of the words spilling from her notebook. She thought about the laughter, the careless dismissals, and it almost made her smile, not in bitterness, but in the quiet vindication of truth finally surfacing, when it mattered most. But there was no time for satisfaction. Each second felt like it carried lives on its back, and her pencil dug deeper, graphite breaking twice, sharpened with the quick edge of a knife, and pushed on without pause. She began to murmur under her breath, not prayers but calculations, the rhythm of permutation tables, her lips shaping the formulas of shifting codes. A private leaned too close, watching her hand, and she felt his stare heavy with disbelief. This wasn't the truck girl they thought they knew. This was something else entirely, a soldier whose battlefield lived in silence and paper. Another sheet spat out of the radio, more garbled code, as if the enemy were speaking directly to her across the storm. She grabbed it, her eyes scanning fast, her fingers flipping to a page in her notebook covered in penciled grids. Her heart gave a jolt. The code wasn't just random chatter now. It was targeting orders, designations meant to guide mortars onto their fuel reserves. She slammed her hand on the table, her voice sharp. "Fuel depot. They're aiming for the depot first." The captain didn't hesitate. He relayed the order, and within moments, units were moving to shield the depot, anti-mortar defenses pivoting like teeth snapping shut. She bent back over her work, sweat beading along her hairline, pencil scratching through the storm of noise. Each line she broke was a breath stolen from the enemy. Each phrase decoded was a life preserved behind the wire. Hours passed like minutes, rain hammering down until the ground outside was a sea of mud. But she didn't stop, didn't even look up except to fire out coordinates, warnings, confirmation. Around her, the soldiers who had sneered that morning no longer spoke at all. They just waited, silent and wide-eyed, hanging on the next word from the cipher they once thought was just a cleaner of trucks. The tent had shifted. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was orbit, and she was its center. Even the captain, hard-eyed and immovable, leaned in each time she lifted her head, trusting her words as if they were gospel. Somewhere in the deep storm, the first mortar thudded, the sound rolling like thunder, answered by the bark of their artillery returning fire. Outside, the ground shook, voices shouted, and yet she remained bent over her notebook, the world narrowed to symbols and scratches, her mind running far ahead of the fight, seeing patterns where others saw noise. And when she finally tore her pencil across the page with a final slash, circling a set of coordinates and pushing it across the table, she knew what it meant before anyone else. "This is it," she whispered, almost to herself. "Their command post. Take it out, and the rest falls apart." The captain's eyes hardened, his jaw set. He relayed the strike order, and minutes later, the night split with the roar of their artillery, shells screaming into the storm. Silence followed, thick and heavy, until the scouts' voices crackled back through the radio. Confirmation, the enemy retreating, their command gutted, their assault broken before it began. She slumped back in her chair, her fingers cramped, her notebook soaked through from rain dripping off her uniform. But she didn't care. For the first time, the silence in the tent wasn't mockery or dismissal. It was awe. Every eye was on her, wide and stunned. The laughter that had once stung her gone forever, burned away by the fire of reality. She didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't need to. She just sat quietly, her pencil still in her hand, the battered notebook before her. And the storm raging outside felt suddenly smaller than the storm she had just dismantled with nothing more than her mind. When the shelling stopped and the storm rolled into a dull, distant growl, the base exhaled all at once, like men and women who had just been pulled from the edge of a cliff they didn't even know they were standing on. And in the center of it all she sat still, her notebook resting beneath her palms, her pencil finally still, her heartbeat the only drum she could hear above the fading echoes of war. Outside, soldiers who had scrambled in panic hours earlier now moved with a stunned calm, voices softer, eyes sharper, each of them knowing they had stood in the crosshairs of an attack designed to cut them in their sleep. An attack that would have succeeded if not for the woman they had mocked that very morning for being on her knees with a brush, scrubbing mud off trucks. The captain was the first to break the silence, his hand pressing down firm on the notebook as if to ground her back in the moment, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of something far heavier than orders. "You bought us time, Valkyrie," he said, not loud, not performative, but with the quiet sincerity of a man who had seen too many lives lost to accidents, to oversights, to misjudgments. She nodded once, not trusting her voice, not needing thanks, because she hadn't done it for recognition. She had done it because it was her duty, carved into her marrow. the burden she carried each day beneath the camouflage of ordinary work. But the others weren't so restrained. Soldiers who had smirked at her brush strokes now stood at the edge of the tent, their faces pale with the knowledge that their laughter could have been their last sound on Earth. One of them, the same one who had called out, "Missed a spot," earlier, looked at her with a mix of shame and respect, his lips parting like he wanted to apologize but couldn't find words strong enough. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need his apology. The battlefield had already rewritten every insult into reverence. The night dragged on into morning, the storm passing to leave the base washed clean and raw, mud pools reflecting the pale light of a rising sun. She walked the perimeter at dawn, her boots sinking into the wet earth, watching soldiers reset defenses, carry wounded, check equipment, all of them moving with a kind of reverence that hadn't been there before. They looked at her differently now, not with the dismissive glances of men who thought they understood what a soldier should look like, but with the weight of recognition, the unspoken acknowledgement that they had seen her in her true form, and it had saved them all. The captain called her into his office later, a makeshift space carved out of canvas and wood, the air thick with the smell of damp paper and sweat. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her notebook tucked tight against her chest. He studied her for a long time, as if recalibrating every memory of her, every report that had crossed his desk, every overlooked detail. Finally, he leaned forward, his elbows creaking the table, his eyes narrowing. "They won't laugh at you again," he said simply, and though she wanted to answer, to brush it off, she just nodded. Because she knew he was right. Not because of him, not because of some speech or order, but because the truth had finally shown itself, undeniable, in the rawest form possible, life and death. That afternoon, while the base hummed with recovery, she returned to the trucks, her brush once again in her hands, mud still clinging stubbornly to steel panels. A private passed by, slowed as if to speak, then thought better of it, and simply offered a respectful nod. Another saluted, awkward but genuine. She said nothing, only dipped her brush back into the bucket, the bristles scraping mud with the same rhythm as always. For her, nothing had changed, yet everything had. Because that was the paradox of her service. Her victories were invisible, her battles fought in silence, her triumphs buried beneath layers of secrecy. And though the soldiers would whisper about Valkyrie Cipher, for months, maybe years, she knew that when the files were sealed and the reports classified, she would go back to being just another face in fatigues, scrubbing trucks, walking the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary. But that was enough. She didn't need medals or speeches, didn't crave the shine of recognition. Her satisfaction came in the sound of the base still alive, in the laughter of men who would see another day, in the knowledge that her silence had shielded them. As dusk fell again, the captain found her outside, the brush hanging loose in her hand, her arms streaked with grime. He stood beside her for a long moment, watching her work, then finally said, "The next time I call, you'll answer faster." She glanced up, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time that day a small, tired smile tugged at her lips. "You won't have to call twice," she replied. And with that, he left her to the mud and the trucks, to the life that had always disguised her true weight, a life she wore like armor. But that night, as she lay in her bunk with the notebook under her pillow, she heard whispers drifting through the barracks, voices carrying the name they had once thought was a joke. "Valkyrie," someone whispered, almost reverently. "Cipher." Another voice repeated it like a prayer. She closed her eyes, the storm in her chest finally quiet, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, being underestimated had always been her greatest shield. And though she knew tomorrow she'd be back at the trucks, scrubbing mud under a sky that no longer felt so heavy, she also knew that nobody in that base would ever see her the same way again. She wasn't the truck girl anymore. She wasn't invisible. She was the cipher that had held the line, the silent hand that had turned chaos into survival. And whether they said it aloud or not, every soldier who crossed her path would remember that when death came knocking in the storm, it was she who answered.